Okay, I am going to go ahead and record this one. Linda's coming back. Linda, yay, you're back. Linda, this is Wayne. Wayne, this is Linda. And
Hi,
so
Wayne.
I welcome you all both to class. We also have, and you'll hear me periodically talking to them. We have Catherine in class. She's out today for a root canal. We have Stephanie, and then we have Ed Barrios. Wayne, you and Ed know each other. And so they will either be in later on or they'll be in next class and present their homework. So this is a recorded class. Y'all have got your handout, right?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, super.
Thank you.
Okay. I look forward to working with you all this week or over these next 4 weeks. The fun thing about Masterclass is that you have to do your homework and then you submit your homework. And the beautiful thing about submitting that homework in front of other students who have worked on the same project is that we get to see what everybody else did. And so it's a great learning experience. Now, Linda, you've got the R5, and then Wayne and I were just talking about switching to the R7. Wayne's using the 7D right now. And then Stephanie has the R6 and Ed Barrios has the R5. So we will be talking about various cameras while we are doing this. So macro photography, and I know Wayne has done macro photography. Linda, have you?
I've played around. I have a macro lens, but
okay,
no formal instruction.
Okay, that's good. So macro photography is when we present something, and I'm going to talk about the natural world in some cases. In other cases, I'm going to give you some other ideas. But macro photography is when we present something closer than what normal human eyesight would be able to see. It's when we can present something that's extremely small and bring it to the forefront so that people can see it. This is a breast feather of a rufous hummingbird, by the way, that I saw fall out and then went and captured it in the garden so that I could photograph it. So we can take things that are very small and then reproduce them so that we can see them in larger detail. And we can explore different things that are in nature, such as the way that water drops on different types of objects in nature, or we can recreate that and in the house and explore it as well. So we can explore things that are small in the world and bring them closer, but it doesn't just have to be nature. It can be all kinds of things, from rivets and bolts, if that's what you want to do. So the beautiful thing about macro photography is that we can photograph small things and bring them to the forefront so that people can enjoy them and we can work with them. So first of all, we've got to start with reproduction ratio. So we'll talk about this as we go along periodically throughout this class. So 1-to-1 simply means that whatever it is in nature is exactly the same size on the sensor of the camera. A 35mm sensor. So that's what, Linda, you have in your 5D, and then Wayne, you have a slightly smaller sensor, 1.6 smaller in your 7D. But a 35mm piece of film is 1.5 inches across. So that's what 35mm is. So this blue jeans frog down in Costa Rica is roughly 1.5 inches across. So if I were able to photograph him so that he completely filled the frame, then that would be 1-to-1 reproduction. 1-to-2 is if I were to photograph him so that he filled half of the frame. And you see that he fills about 1/4 of the frame. So this would be about a 1-to-4 reproduction on this blue jean tree frog. If I could photograph him 2-to-1, then he would be twice as big on the sensor as he is in real life. So your reproduction ratios, when we start talking about what your lenses can do, this is what we're talking about with reproduction ratio. So remember that a 35mm piece of film is 1.5 inches across. And then this little frog is about 1.5 inches across as well. So not very big, just a little bit, little pretty small. So your lens choice, I've given you a ton of information about lenses here and just, more information probably than what you need, but I want to cover it briefly because I want you to understand that, and everybody else on the class, that we can do macro photography with any lens we own. Macro photography is not limited to just a macro lens. It can be done with any lens that we operate with. So you see that this owl eye butterfly is photographed with a 300 millimeter lens, but I can get the same size without cropping if I go with a 17 to 35 millimeter lens, but I just have to get much, much closer. So if you're going to photograph rattlesnakes and macro, it's better to use a 300 millimeter lens instead of a 17 to 35 millimeter lens. So what lens we use to do our macro photography doesn't mean that we really have to use a quote macro lens. Macro photography is just close-up photography. So I'm going to show you some various lenses. And Linda, you said you've got the 105. Wayne, do you have a macro lens per se?
I've got a Sigma 150.
150 macro lens.
It's an older macro lens.
Okay. Okay. So the Canon 105 macro lens, and I'm not talking about the RF lens. I'm talking about the traditional macro lens, the 105. It focuses to 11.8 inches. So it focuses to almost a foot. Linda, do you have yours in hand?
I thought mine was 100 millimeter. Does that make sense?
It could be that we've switched to 100 with the new one. Yeah.
No, mine's an old lens. I had it with my Rebel, but
Okay.
I can go grab it.
No, that's okay. So you've got the 105 then.
No, I think it's 100.
It's 100. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you
And
might
I have a adapter for my new camera.
for the new camera. Okay. So then you're working with one of the older ones as well. And this one focuses to 11.8 inches. And then on that true macro lens, focusing to 1.8 inches, it has a 1-to-1 ratio, which means if you could get close enough in that focusing distance, then you can photograph something at life size. So that's what your true macro lenses are. The new one, the new 85 macro f2 and the RF, this is one of the less expensive of the newer Canon RF lenses. This has a reproduction ratio of 1-to-2, meaning that you're going to only get half of life size, and it focuses to 1.15 inches. So it focuses fairly, 1 foot, 0.15. The Tamron, this has become a real famous of the macro lenses. It's a 90 millimeter, 2.8. And it once again has 1-to-1 reproduction ratio. So when you're buying a macro lens, you do want to look at whether it has a 1-to-1 reproduction ratio or a 1-to-2 reproduction ratio. If it has a 1-to-1 reproduction ratio, then you're usually paying a bit more than a 1-to-2 reproduction ratio. And the 1-to-1 reproduction ratio just simply means that those water drops are the same size that they are in real life. So you can get a bit closer to your subjects, and the same thing with the Nautilus shell. Wayne, do you see on your Sigma if it says it's 1-to-1 reproduction, or is it 1-to-2? Hey, Stephanie. Does it say on it? I bet you
I'm so sorry I'm late. I was
that's okay.
Taking my night photography class.
Yeah, I think it's a 1-to-2, Wayne.
Yeah, it says 1-to-2.8.
1-to-2. No, that's just your f-stop.
Yeah, that's my f-stop.
Yeah, there should be another reproduction ratio on there somewhere.
But like I say, this is 10, 15 years old. So
yeah, and it might not have anything on it, because if it were like a 1-to-4, it wouldn't really be advertising as a 1-to-1 lens would be doing. So we'll move on. So every lens, once again, can be a macro lens. So my 16 to 35, for instance, a wide angle lens that you would use for landscape photography, look at that. It gets as close as 11 inches also. So where a macro lens gets 12 inches, then the 16 millimeter wide angle lens allows you to get closer, which puts you at 11 inches instead of 12 inches or 12.1 inches. Here's the 24 to 105, and this is the older version, not the new version, but this minimum focusing distance focuses to 17 inches. And this Canon 24 to 105, including the new one, the RF, has a macro feature on it, but that just means that that's when you're in close focus. It doesn't focus any closer and it doesn't give you a 1-to-1 reproduction ratio, but it does allow you to focus fairly close. And so that's good. This, by the way, is nutmeg, and the interior nut, that's the nutmeg, and the exterior shell, that's the mace, if you've ever used mace in your pumpkin pies or something like that. The 50 millimeter that Canon puts out focuses to 18 inches. And this is one of the things that drives me crazy about this lens, is that it focuses so far away. So a 24 to 105, I can focus much, much closer than I can with this crazy 50 millimeter. And that's one of the reasons my 50 millimeter sits in the closet most of the time. And then I haven't bought a new one for my RF because it just doesn't focus very close. You have to stay pretty far away from your subject with this lens. 70 to 300, and this is the old one. It focuses to 4.9 feet, which means that you're almost 5 feet away from your subject. So it zooms out to 300, but this also has a really far focusing distance with it. But then you put the 70 to 200 Canon on, and this has a minimum focusing distance of 3.28 feet. So that 70 to 300 was 4.95 feet. But this one brings you into 3.28 feet. By the way, those of you with the R cameras, or Wayne thinking about moving to the R camera, the 70 to 200 f4 for the R cameras is so sweet. It is just an absolutely beautiful lens with great technology in it. And it does focus pretty close, which is good. So even a lens like the 100 to 400 has a fairly close focusing capability. So we can do macro with a lens like this. So we can do something like a spider web, or we can do something like the interior of a sunflower. So even our telephoto lenses like the 1 to 400, or these also have close focusing capabilities, or what we consider close focusing for macro photography. 70 to 300 millimeter f4. Wayne, do you still have this lens?
The 300, yes.
Yeah. This is just like one of my all-time favorites. Wayne and I used it for years, like years ago, and it focuses to 4.92 feet, but at 4.92 feet at 300 millimeters on a prime lens, it's an absolutely amazing macro lens. And once again, allows you not to have to get so close to your subject, allows you to stay further away from your subject, like this Texas crescent butterfly. And then the new 1 to 500 RF lens, this now focuses to 2.95 feet. So we've got a closer focusing on this newer telephoto lens that Canon has given us. And this allows us at 500 millimeters to only be 2 feet away, which is like slightly less than a yard away from the subject, which means that we can get a small subject without having to get right up in its face and disturb it, fairly large in the frame. So this new 1 to 500, it still functions equally as a good macro lens, just like our old 1 to 400 did. Put a tele extender on this, makes you 700 millimeters. And this means, once again, that we get close focusing, 2.9 feet, but we also have more magnification. So this becomes, once again, one of those really, really nice macro lenses, even though we would consider this a bird lens instead of a close-up lens, but it functions really, really well. So once again, throw that 1.4x extender on it. This puts us at 700 millimeters, and it becomes a great macro lens. And then here's the 70 to 200, the new one, RF. Much, much lighter than the old one. And this is the F4, by the way, the 270 to 200 F4. It has a minimum focusing distance of 1.97 feet, so a little bit less than 2 feet. And then this allows us to use this lens as a macro lens as well. So any of your lenses that you use can be macro lenses. And in your homework assignment, what you're going to do is you're going to pick out a couple of your lenses, and you're going to start out by getting as close as you can to your subject. So figuring out what your minimum focusing distance is, and then using it in 2 of your lenses as macro lenses. So you'll see how well they focus when they're actually up close. So questions about lenses before I leave them? Nope, y'all good?
I'm good.
Okay, now we come to gadgets that we can add to make getting even closer. So moving over to page 2 of your handout, getting even closer with your gadgets that we can add. So we can get initially close to our subject. So, our monarch butterfly on our milkweed. Okay, this is kind of your basic introductory macro photograph. And we can do this with almost any lens that we own, as long as we don't disturb the butterfly. But now I'm going to introduce you to close-up lenses and extension tubes. Wayne, do you have the close-up lens?
Now I've got extension tubes.
You got extension tubes. Okay. So this is what a close-up lens is. So it is a screw-on to the front of your lens close-up filter, and it's called a close-up lens, even though to us it looks like a filter. And you can see, yeah, it magnifies pretty well, doesn't it? So you screw this on to the front of your lens, and it allows you to use any lens much, much closer than what it would. So this monarch egg is going to be photographed with my 24 to 105. So just my basic old ordinary walk around lens. And I'm going to use a close-up filter on it. And I'll give you more information on this as we go along, and extension tubes. Now, extension tubes are hollow tubes that fit between your lens and your camera. So Wayne, you can put your extension tubes. Do you have an extension tube handy, Wayne?
Yes, ma'am. This is a
Yeah, there you
Canon.
go. So that's an extension tube. So it has no glass in it at all.
Nope.
And all it's doing is, there you go. And all, move back just a little bit. Wait, there you go. All it's doing is, by moving the lens further away from the sensor, it causes magnification. So it allows, erase that completely. By moving the lens further away from the sensor, it allows the minimum focusing distance to be reduced. So with an extension tube, where you used to be able to focus to, say, a foot, now you can focus to half a foot. And there's different sizes of extension tubes. So the more extension tube you use, the closer you can get. Add a close-up filter on the front of that lens. So one of these, along with the extension tube that Wayne showed you, and now you can reduce that focusing distance even more. So this allows me, with the 24 to 105 lens, basic old ordinary lens, close-up lens on the front, extension tube on the back, it now allows me to see the ridges on a monarch egg. But for what I wanted to do, this wasn't enough. And I'll show you the setup here. So what I've got going on is I've got a fake background, which by the way, I use a lot in macro photography. And all that my fake backgrounds are is blurry photographs. So when I take a blurry photograph, I don't delete it. I save it as a background. And I just give it the file name background and put it in my files. This is just printed off my printer. I don't care the quality for this type of work. So this is just a basic old inkjet print on a piece of paper. That's all it is. And then what you see here, this is before I went with my R5. So here's my 24-105 lens right here. Here's my extension tube. And this is one of the larger extension tubes to let me get even closer. And then there is a close-up filter on the front. And then I've got one flash up on the top. I've got some clamps that are holding the leaves in place. I've got another flash off to the side. And this is how I ended up photographing that monarch egg. Here's the same background. And this is a Polyphemus moth cocoon, about so big. And here's what that looks like. So, you know, using my high-tech water bottle tripod over here on the side to hold the clamp steady. And then these are all called Plamps, by the way, P-L-A-M-P, and you buy them from the Wimberley company. I have a variety of them that sit in a tote whenever I need them. But here's the Polyphemus cocoon right here. Here's the background being held up off the end of the table with some other clamps. Here's the two flashes. Here's the cord on the flash. And then that's what it looks like on the back of the camera. So this is using the extension tube and the close-up filter to photograph something that's about like that. And then once again, get it to where it's filling the frame. We can see all the details in it. We can see where the moth emerged, etc. So the close-up filter, you buy this for the front of your lens. And most of the Canon professional level lenses are 77 millimeters. So this means that I can put this close-up filter on almost any one of my Canon lenses. By the way, this Canon 500D, it's called a Canon 500D. The factory that made these went underwater during the tsunami that hit Japan many years ago. Nikon used to call these 5Ts, and Nikon quit making them eons ago. 20 years ago. So the only place we could get one of these was from Canon. And it doesn't matter what camera body you're using or what lens you're using. All that matters is it has a 77 millimeter thread or a 56 millimeter thread or a 72 millimeter thread. So whatever thread you have on your lens, that's what you buy the 500D from Canon to fit that lens. So you just check to see what your lens thread is, and it's usually going to be a 77 or a 72 or 68 or something like that. So you just find out, and then that's what you buy. So back to my story that this factory was destroyed by the tsunami. Well, it turns out that there's somebody in Japan that evidently bought a bunch of these because where we couldn't get them for years, they're suddenly on eBay. And I've had students over the last year and a half that have been buying them on eBay, and yep, they're legitimate, straight out of the Canon factory. But according to Canon, they're not being made anymore. So if you go on eBay and look for one of these 500D Canon close-up lenses, maybe the guy still has a bunch of them, because for a while they were being offered at a fairly good price on eBay. You might also find some that are used because a lot of people buy these, don't really know how to use one, and then they end up selling it. So I bet you can pick up a used one. And then once again, the neat thing about this close-up lens filter is that I can put this on any lens I own that has a 77 millimeter thread on it. The extension tubes, on the other hand, are Canon specific, or if you're Nikon, Nikon specific. So these have to be specific for your lens mount. The Canon extension tubes, the only ones that are out there right now are the 25 and the 12, but you put them together and this gives you 36. So if you hook them together, then that gives you the third size for extension tubes. Unfortunately, these are not available for the R cameras yet. So we would have to use an adapter ring to put them on an R camera. So they're not available yet. There are some knockoff brands that are available for the Rs, but I have not tried them yet. But the neat thing about extension tubes, once again, is you can put these on any lens. So if you have a 500 millimeter lens, you can put an extension tube on it and let you get closer to your subject. If you have a 100 to 500, you can put an extension tube on it and let you get closer to your subject. So extension tubes minimize the focusing distance for any lens that you put them on. Extenders, 1.4x extenders, multiply the lens. So an extender has glass in it and it allows for more magnification. Extension has no glass in it and it allows you to get closer to your subject. So it minimizes your focusing distance. So we can put close-up filter on the front, extension tube on the back, and now we can get super, super close to our subjects. So one way of getting even closer to our subject, even if we have a macro lens. So we can add these, but once again, we don't have extension tubes for our R series from Canon. We would have to buy those from a second vendor. So this is a little javelina flower out in the deserts of West Texas. It's a very small flower. And if I put an extension tube on the back of the lens, close-up filter on the front of the lens, then that's now the flower. So by adding these extension tubes and close-up filters, we can get even closer to our subjects. And then we can do macro photography with any lens we own. So they're a nice gadget to have. Here's my wide angle lens, 16 to 35 millimeter lens. So this is what I would use for grand landscapes. I would use this out in West Texas. I'm going to use it when when we go to Northern Ireland in September. Linda's joining me for that trip. So this is what I would use for grand landscapes. It focuses to 11 inches, which means I can also go out into the garden and use it as a macro lens because it focuses to 11 inches away. So I get a wider field of view if I use my wide angle lens as a macro lens. But if I put the close-up filter, once again, this little gadget, if I put this gadget on the front of that 16 to 35 millimeter lens, now I can get even closer to it. And now I can work even closer to the flowers than I would had I just not had that on at all. So the neat thing with these close-up filters and extension tubes is it gives us the ability to add them to any lens we use, and then we can get even closer with those lenses. So here's the same flower done with an extension tube. So you see that between the three images, one's without anything, one's with a close-up filter, and one's with an extension tube. And so it just gives us the ability to photograph macro subjects with any lens we own. Questions on those?
Well, I was just thinking for travel, if you had a close-up, lens like that, it would take up less space.
It takes up less space than another lens. And you know what's neat about this too, and Wayne's used this with me in Costa Rica. Costa Rica, we're in the rainforest, it's humid, it's hot. You don't want to take a lens off and put a new lens on. But you can screw this onto the front of your lens, and now you can photograph leafcutter ants or little frogs or whatever by using this. And so, yeah, this takes up a whole lot less space, and you throw it in your pocket, and you always have a macro lens at your convenience.
So you like these better than having a per se macro lens? I have the Tamron 90 millimeter.
So if I had a per se macro lens, I would still put this on my macro lens.
Okay.
So yes, it just allows you to get even closer. Yeah, and I found that when I did own the 105 macro lens, it didn't get close enough for what I wanted. And with my 85 millimeter, I still find that it doesn't get as close as I want. So yes, the neat thing about this is we can add this and we can get even closer. So this is magnolia bloom with extension tubes on the back, close-up filters on the front. And so now I have very little depth of field. We'll talk about that in just a second, but it gives me the ability to get that kind of really dreamy appearance to a photograph because I'm working at such high magnification. Got to be on a tripod for this.
Is there a limit to how many extension tubes you can stack?
No, you can do all three of them if you want to. And so that what happens though, at that point is that lens is right up against your subject.
Yep.
So it's your working distance at that point. But no, there's, I think this is 2 stacked extension tubes. So this is a 36 extension tube when you put them together and a close-up filter on the front. And magnolias are blooming right now. So we've got those big flowers we can work with. So this, once again, is a moth cocoon that I found out in the yard. And here's what it looks like photographing it. So I'm just putting it on top of a mirror and using an LED light. We'll talk about this next class with lighting these subjects. And then is close-up filter on the front, extension tube on the back. And here's the whole setup is from the top, extension tube on the back, close-up filter on the front. So just using the 24 to 105. So, you know, it's a wide angle lens, not a wide angle lens, but a street lens, walking around lens, but it allows me to do all kinds of little tiny things once I put the extension tube on the back and the close-up filter on the front. So we've got this other device, and this is called a Photodio X Macro Bellows, and it's on your handout. By the way, it does not cost much money. So I'm surprised at how little this thing cost. It's a knockoff. We used to have these in the, 30 years ago that you spent a lot of money for. But this does, like the extension tube, it moves the lens away from the camera. So the further that lens is away from the camera, the closer you're going to be able to focus. And so that's what your focusing bellows is. And it's a Photodio X Macro Bellows. And once again, it doesn't cost very much money. I forgot how much it is right now, but it's a pittance, but it could be fun to play with. And then this is called a Movo reversing ring. And here's those monarch eggs again. And what happened, by the way, was during COVID, I was out in the garden and I saw a monarch lay an egg. So on one of my milkweeds. So I came inside and I told my husband about it. He said, "Oh, great, we can write about it." Well, that means I need to photograph that egg. And my friend, Carlos Hernandez, told me a couple of years ago, make sure you plant some milkweed in a pot, because when you want to photograph it, you can take the pot inside. And lo and behold, I had monarch eggs on my potted milkweed and it allowed me to bring them inside. So I didn't have to do this outside. So it just a tip for you is plant some of your milkweed in a pot so that you have it when you want to photograph your monarch eggs. So anyway, I'm on this quest during COVID to photograph these monarch eggs. So this is how big I can get a monarch egg using a Movo reversing ring. And this is what the thing looks like. Here's the side that goes into your camera right here. So you screw this into your camera. This does not fit the mirrorless unless you use the adapter ring. Your lens goes in between and you put your lens on backwards. So the front of your lens goes on this side and the back of your lens goes on this side. So you are reversing your lens. And then you're going to take your picture out of this end right here. So everything hooks onto your camera like this with a reversed lens. When you reverse your lens, that means you're using your lens backwards, and this gives you even more magnification. So you don't have to use the extension tube. You don't have to use the close-up filter, but you do have to. So now you can reverse your lens. So this is a 70 to 200, just changing the background. And you see now I can get those nice ridges on that monarch egg. I can get the little hairs on the milkweed. So I'm getting much, much closer to my subject now. And this is what it looks like if we reverse the lens on a peacock feather. So getting even closer to that peacock feather with that reversing lens. Now, here's what it looks like. So this side goes against the camera. I've got that wrong, by the way. And then the lens is reversed and then it's put between. The Movo people recommend the Canon 24 millimeter. So I ended up buying the 24 millimeter just because they recommended it. I'll get to that in a little bit. So here's what it looks like on a blue milkweed bloom. And this blue milkweed bloom is probably about this big. So watch this video because this is what it looks like when I go out and photograph the blue milkweed. Watch. So when I get out there and start photographing it and quit bouncing the flower, I realize that there are thrips inside the flower that come out once the human goes away. So what I ended up photographing were the little bugs that live inside a flower that's less than an inch across. So this is what you can get with the Movo reversing ring. Cool, isn't it? They creeped me out completely. I had no idea what they were. And when they started coming out of the flower, it was like, oh my God, look at those things. You know, don't let them get on me. But they live inside the flower, this little inch long flower, you know? So this is pretty interesting. Here's a pantry moth. I'm sure if you feed birds, you've had the pantry moths in your bird seed. And this is focus stacked. We'll get to focus stacking in just a bit. And then here's the inside of a Gerber daisy. And then the problem with this, using the 28 millimeter lens, is that you start casting a shadow on your subject. So Wayne, you were asking how many extension tubes can I put together? You can put a lot together, but once you start getting so close, you end up casting a shadow on your subject or hitting your subject in some case. So in this case with this 28, I found that I was getting so close to my subject many times that I was casting a shadow on the subject. So it wasn't as interesting. But here's the interior once again of a peacock feather. So you see how close we can get with this Movo. And then here it is using my 24 to 105 millimeter lens, again, turned it backwards. So here's the front of the lens. That's where the red dial, the red ring is. And then here it's hooked onto the camera. So I found this was a little bit easier for me because I had a bit more working distance than I did with the 28 millimeter that the Movo people suggested. So here's another shot of doing that with the Movo hooked onto it. Here's a blue jay feather. And here's a downy woodpecker feather. And you find yourself, or I found myself photographing close-up subjects, but then I also had to remind myself that that's not a very interesting photograph. So, okay, I got close, I can see the flower, I got it in focus, the background's okay. But then once I got there and spent all that time working on it, I realized it's not an interesting photograph. So be careful. This is the interior of a petunia. Be careful that when you start in on this rabbit hole, that what you're photographing is worth photographing, because the interior of petunia is not very interesting once you start digging around on it. And these are my little tiny micro crystal balls. So here's what it looks like once again with this Movo. Here's the little crystal ball set up right here, a little shot glass filled with crystal balls. So that's what they look like. And then a flower behind it with the clamp. here's the reversed ring right here. And then here's what it looks like if I put an LED light behind the little crystal balls. And then here's the whole setup using my 5D. So you can see I've got the lens reversed. It's hooked onto the camera. And then here in front of me is the little jar, little shot glass filled with crystal balls, tiny crystal balls. So you see what a small working distance I'm dealing with. I've got tweezers there. And that just gives you an idea of what the setup is like. So the conclusion after using this MOVO is that this is nearly impossible to do outside. So there are these YouTube videos with these people who tell you that this is how they do their macro photography in their garden, and they show themselves happily skipping around their garden, photographing macro objects. And the reality, guys, is this thing is so close. And also, because you're magnifying so close, you're each jostle of the camera is magnified. So there's no hand holding this thing outside. And I don't care what people say on the internet, there's no hand holding this thing outside. I did well with just putting it on a tripod. So it sits in my closet right now, but it is out there and it is an option if you would like to consider it. And Wayne, you've got the 7D. Do you want me to put it in the mail to you? You want to try it?
Sure.
Okay, I'll put it in the mail to you. Okay, because it doesn't fit on the R cameras. So I'll send it to you and see what you think about it. Okay.
Okay, that'll work.
Okay, so here's another extreme option. This is a Canon MPE 65mm lens. And you see from the extension on the barrel here that this goes from 1:1 magnification to 1:2 to 1:3 to 1:4 to 1:5, 5 times life size with this lens. So during COVID, when I was photographing these monarch eggs, I still couldn't get as close as I wanted. And so I remembered that Canon made this lens, but it's a fairly expensive lens and you only use it for one thing. It's not like a common lens you would use. So I decided, this was before I went to the R's, I decided that I would rent it. And so I rented it online. And then about 15 minutes later, I got a call from the online company. And the guy said, I see you ordered an MPE 65 for rent. And he said, do you know how to use this lens? And of course I'd say yes, because I come from corporate America and you never admit you don't know how to do anything. You can always figure something out. So he said, now, do you know what it does? And I said, yeah. And he said, do you have a focusing rail? And I said, yeah. And he said, okay, I'll ship it to you because you know what you do with it. And so, okay, good. So I passed the 3-question test. And I get it. And now I have to figure out how to use this, because when you extend this to 5 times life size, that's how long the lens is. And that's how close you are to your subject. So here's what it looks like. Life-size monarch egg. So I'm getting closer, and this is a 1:1 reproduction ratio. 2 times life size. 3 times life size, 4 times life size, and finally 5 times life size. So this is what I was finally going for, 5 times life size of a monarch egg, but this is extreme. To take those photos took me probably 4 hours of work. Because by the time you get to 5 times life size, really at 4 times, 3 times life size, there can be no air conditioning shaking the floor. There can be no walking on the floor. There can be no air movement. So I'm working on this in the summer upstairs in my office, and there can be no washer and dryer going downstairs. There can be no air conditioner going on, and I can't walk on the floor. So by the time you get to 5 times life size, you start realizing how much vibration there is in this world. So the camera has to be stabilized, completely locked down, cable release, mirror lockup, the whole bit. And then there has to be no walking on the floor, no movement at all. So that's when you start realizing how much a house moves in the upper floors. So it's a fun lens to play with. It's an interesting thing to play with, but it also is very interesting to figure out just how much work it takes to get to something like 5 times life size with no cropping. And here's something that I found super, super interesting. So here's a monarch egg on the same milkweed, but it's hatched. The monarch larvae has come out. But what I didn't know is you see these 2 threads that hold the egg up. Notice in this one, there's no threads holding it up. But in this one, there are threads holding it up. And here's a thrip, by the way, look at that. But what I'm curious about is when the monarch egg, the monarch larvae comes out of this egg, does it flip around and put those silk threads on the egg to keep the egg upright? I don't know. So anyway, this monarch egg that had been hatched had the silk threads on it. And then here's those darn thrips again. They live everywhere. So once you see them, they'll start getting creepy. So it's fun to work with this, but once again, this is pretty high magnification. So here's a pinned butterfly that I happen to have in a box. So he's been pretty mangled over the years because he's been used for several different things. Here's life size of a monarch caterpillar. And then here, once again, are egg cases on the back side of that monarch leaf. Here's life size of a monarch caterpillar again. And remember that this is bringing them inside because we can't, this lens has too much magnification to take it outside. And then this is a little inchworm that I happen to have running across a leaf. And this is once again life size. So this Canon 65 millimeter specialty lens, but it does allow you to get life size on subjects. So it's kind of crazy. So once again, your magnification ratios, 1:1 means it's the same size that it is on the sensor as it is in real life. So 1:1. 2:1 means that the image on the sensor is 2 times as big as in real life. And 4:1 is that the image on the sensor is 4 times as big as it is in real life. So 1-inch sensor, 1-inch subject is twice as big, and 1-inch subject is 4 times as big. If the big number is on the other side, then we're 1/2 and 1/4 as big as in life size. So where this really comes into play also is in your depth of field. So you know how your lens, your macro lens is a 2.8? Wayne's yours 2.8?
Yes, ma'am.
And Stephanie 2.8? Think so, yeah, okay. So this is a penny. And using 1:1 magnification, so that means it's as big as it is in real life. No, it's bigger than it is. So this would be 2:1 reproduction because a penny is 3/4 of an inch across, and a 35 millimeter sensor is 1.5 inches across. So this is 2:1. At f22, that's how much depth of field we have if we are 2 times life size. That's 22. That's 8. So 2 times life size, that's how much depth of field we have at f8. And F4, that's how much depth of field we have. So if we're going to do high magnification photography, whether it be 1:1 or whether it be 2:1 or 4:1, or whether we do half size or quarter size, you've got to realize that this also affects your depth of field, because the closer you are to the subject, the narrower your depth of fields are. The further you are from your subject, the wider your depth of fields are. So 2 times life size at F4, that's how much depth of field we have compared to F22. But look at F22. It's just the end, it's just the back of Abraham Lincoln's hair. That's all we've got on our depth of field. So this little statue, I thought I'd put a ruler next to it so you could see the exact same thing. So this is my 85mm lens. At F4, I have 0.2 of an inch depth of field. 0.2 of an inch. It's not very much. At F8, I have 1/2 an inch. So I have 1/2 an inch of depth of field. And then if I go all the way to 22, I get a whopping inch of depth of field. If I'm as close to focus, if I'm focused as close as I can to the little statue. So if you're going to use that macro lens, and if you're going to use that macro lens really close, what you've got to realize, or as close as it'll focus, what you've got to realize is that we're photographing with an F8 to an F22. So your 2.8 isn't going to do you any good because it's so shallow of a depth of field, unless you're going for artsy type of thing. So this is a whole F22, and this gives me an inch on my ruler. If I go to 140mm, so add more magnification, 6.3 only gives me 0.6 of an inch. F8 gives me 1/2 an inch. And F45, because this lens has a 45, and no wonder it's got a 45, because now I get a whole 2.5 inches. So you notice how, if we're as close as we can get with our lens, the more magnification we have, the less depth of field we're going to have. So this is where we're going to have to use our F8 to our F22 or F45 in this case with this lens. So we're not going to shoot at those 4.5s or those 3.5s or those 2.8s. And then this is my whopping 560mm. So this is my 100 to 400mm lens put on a tripod. And then it has a 1.4x extender. And at F8, which is the minimum focusing for that lens, I have 0.2 of an inch of depth of field. 0.2 of an inch. That's it. So very little depth of field when I'm focused as close as I can possibly get with that lens at F8. And then if I go to F45, which that lens goes to F45, I get a whopping 1 inch of depth of field. So this is my 100 to 400mm lens with a 1.4x extender added, meaning that I'm at 560mm. And at F45, I can get 1 inch of depth of field. So this explains also why Canon would make a lens with F45. So my 1 to 500mm lens also has an F45. Why? Because when I'm focused as close as I want to get, as I can get, I might end up using F45. But then that means camera's going to have to be on a tripod because that's a really closed down f-stop. So that's one of the reasons why you see that lenses are constructed the way that they are. So, you know, an F45, you would never think of using an F45, but lo and behold, in macro photography, we might use an F45 if we were using our 1 to 400 with a tele extender for macro photography. Notice too that you can see dust on the feet of the little statue. So he's got dusty feet. So questions on that? Does that help you understand and grasp a little bit of the depth of field? And maybe why macro photography hasn't been successful in the past? Because if we're trying to use a 2.8 on that lens, it's not going to work. Yeah.
Well, it's new to me. so.
I was going to say, I'm going to have to rewatch this a couple of times.
That's okay. That's okay. It's a master class. That's why you got it. I can throw really hard stuff at you. That's why you're here. Okay. So a basic of macro photography is called flat to the film plane. So the sensor in the back of your camera is absolutely flat. It's absolutely flat. Your depth of field is a flat plane parallel to the back of the camera. So if you tilt your camera like this, your depth of field goes like this. If you tilt your camera like this, your depth of field goes like this. I taught you all that in basic photography. But in macro photography, it becomes even more important because you notice how little depth of field we have even at f/45. So we have to keep our camera as parallel to our subject as we possibly can to maximize our depth of field. And this is called flat to the film plane. Even though we don't have a film plane anymore, we have a sensor. So this little queen larvae right here, you notice how I've kept the camera as parallel to the back of its body as I possibly can to maximize my depth of field. And this is with my 100 to 500 millimeter lens with a 1.4x extender, using it as a macro lens. So just getting as close as I can get. And by the way, part of your homework assignment is learning how to get as close as you can. I've been doing it for so long that it's just second nature to me to be able to get as close as I possibly can with that lens. So it's just one of those things where you just learn it, and then that way you don't have to hum and haw when you're trying to figure out how close I can actually get.
What lens were you using again?
100 to 500 on my R camera. Yeah, with a 1.4x extender. So this is running the equivalent of your 100 to 400 with a 1.4x extender. And then the queen butterfly over here, the same thing. You see how I've kept those wings absolutely parallel to the back of the camera. So trying to keep those as flat to the film plane as possible allows us to maximize our depth of field. And this queen butterfly over here is post-processed with textures. So this has a texture overlaid on it. And there's a class tonight, if you're willing to take another master's class in textures and adding textures to your photography, but it allows you to turn your photos into watercolors or oil paintings or something like that. So kind of fun to play with. So flat to the film plane with this bacillus lizard in Costa Rica. Wayne, I think you were with me when we probably took this one at La Selva years and years and years ago. If his beak to his fin is absolutely parallel to the back of the camera, then I can get nose to fin in focus. But if I'm not flat to the film plane, then you notice how my depth of field cuts through on the eye. Nose is out of focus, fin is out of focus. So flat to the film plane means that we position ourselves so that we're absolutely parallel to that subject to maximize our depth of field at a shallow f-stop. So absolutely parallel to this Polyphemus moth. We raised these 1 year. Took 2 years, by the way, for them to come out of their chrysalises. So for 2 years, a chrysalis covered in silk and leaves sat on our windowsill, and it looked like a hairball. So every once in a while I had to tell the housekeepers not to clean them off and then one day they decided to emerge. Dragonflies, we would do this, absolutely keeping the camera parallel to the body of the dragonfly so that we maximize that depth of field. This is once again with the 100 to 400 millimeter lens, or to our beautiful golden orb spiders. I hate these creatures, but we get them every summer. So they're just part of life. Yeah, but keep the camera absolutely parallel to them. And then we can maximize our shallow depth of field. And then if you photograph the red-eyed tree frogs in Costa Rica, the first time you do it and don't keep both eyes in focus, then you learn that those eyes are in a flat parallel field. So we have to keep those eyes both together in the same plane to get those eyes in the same depth of field. So flat to the film plane. And here with this little butterfly feather, I was explaining earlier, this is a breast feather off of a butterfly. I saw it fall from the butterfly when it came to the feeder. So I grabbed it, it's tiny as all get out, and then photographed it. And here I've turned it a little on the sideways as opposed, because there's really no flat to the film plane on a feather like this. And then also on your cameras, everybody's camera, you all have a depth of field preview button on it, whether it's an R or whether it's a traditional digital SLR. And that depth of field preview button allows you to push it. And now when you look through the viewfinder, it closes down the aperture. So it might get dark through the viewfinder because the aperture is closed down. But this now lets you see exactly how much depth of field you have. So whether you use an f8 or an f16 or an f32, that depth of field preview button allows you to see exactly how much depth of field you actually have. So it's right, it's a tiny little button on the side of your camera. You probably never used it or only used it occasionally, because there's really the only use we have for it is to find out exactly how much depth of field the specific f-stop is doing for us. So how close we are, how much magnification we're using, that little depth of field preview button allows us to see exactly how much depth of field we actually have. Questions on flat to the film plane or depth of field or depth of field preview button?
I didn't know about that button. I think I'm going to try it.
Yeah, it comes in real handy. And, you know, we'll use it for landscape photography as well, because that tells us whether we need to focus on the rock closest to us or do we focus on the next rock out in the field, because we can actually set our focus and then punch that depth of field preview button and see whether the mountains in the background are actually in focus or not. Yeah, so it's got some uses for it. Yeah. And then there is this thing called a focusing rail. So I showed you a bellows earlier, but this is a focusing rail. And I always put off buying one of these because they were so expensive. But of course, we have all these knockoffs now. So this is a newer Pro 4-way focusing rail. And lo and behold, it only costs $39 from Amazon. And this is what I used when I was photographing the monarch eggs at 5x magnification. And I like this little gadget. Camera sits on the top. The bottom of it sits on your tripod. And then instead of having to, you know, once we're close, instead of having to move the tripod or move the subject to get us right where we want to be with the focusing, we actually can move these little dials. So we can move the camera over, left, right, and we can move the camera forward and backwards. And when you're in close-up magnification, I'm sure you figured this out before when you've been working tight. When you're in close-up magnification, trying to move the camera back just knocks everything out of alignment. And then trying to move the subject closer or further away knocks everything out of alignment as well. So this is a neat gadget. You could use it out in the field because it does fit on the tripod. But if it's more for if we bring a subject in and we're going to photograph it inside. And I like doing a lot of macro photography inside. It's just more comfortable if I can bring the subject in. I'm not going to bring a snake inside, but you know, if it's a subject that I can, you know, like a monarch larvae or something like that, I might bring it inside. So this is a newer Pro 4-way focusing rail. And once again, it's only $39. You're not going to use it a lot, but in macro photography, it's got some really good purposes to it. And it is a nice gadget to have, especially if we're starting to do some setup stuff, you know, like a fly in the house and we're trying to get its eyes really big. This might be a really nice gadget to have. Questions?
How do you get the fly to sit still?
That's your problem. You know? And, there are some people with the flies that they'll do this like in the garage with the garage door open, because, you can't have any wind for this type stuff. And they'll put a log up and then put some honey on that log, and that'll attract the flies. I was over at my son's garage the other day, and he was complaining about the horse flies being in his garage. And so, that would be one of those things where you might be able to do that. Yeah. Okay. So questions about any of that really complicated and detailed stuff that I covered?
I think I'm gonna have to take out a loan. I just need to keep buying stuff.
I know. Earlier, while you were muted, Linda, when you were tending to the grandchildren, Wayne told me how much money I cost him, that I'm an expensive friend to have. I really am. Yeah. It's an expensive hobby, but most adult hobbies are expensive. And so,
Well, I'm a gadget girl.
yeah.
And so while you've been talking, I've been shopping.
Oh, okay. They're on the way, huh?
So they do have that. Okay, so the 77 millimeter, they do have that on eBay, guys.
Okay. Well, make sure your lenses have 77 millimeter opening.
Right. That's what I was going to ask. Where do you find that?
It's on the front of your lens.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So you'll notice that 77 millimeter somewhere on the front of your lens.
Okay.
So just make sure you're buying for the right size and for what lens you're going to try to use it on.
Right.
But Canon traditionally has made the professional lenses 77 millimeters. They'll occasionally throw us off and give us a 78 millimeter, but most of the time it's 77 millimeters. Other questions? Nope. Okay, so your homework assignment for this lesson, and you will take these pictures and then you will submit them to me before next Monday afternoon, if you would. You are going to select 3 of your lenses. So 3 lenses that you've got that you want to play with. Try one, your wide angle lens. Try a lens that you would not normally use for macro photography. And you're going to focus as close as you can on a small object. So the key is you need to get as close as you can focus. Okay. So don't focus further away, get as close as you can focus. And then do flat to the film plane. So get your subject all parallel up to the back of the camera, and with the background 6 to 9 feet away. So I want the background to be far away, 6 feet away, so that we can blow the background out. So we're going to also work on what the blurry background looks like for next lesson also. So at your widest f-stop, so that might be your 2.8 or your 1.4, depending on what lens you're using, at your f8, and then at your smallest f-stop. So that might be your 32, 22, or even 45. And so you're going to take 3 pictures with each lens of the same subject, please, flat to the film plane with the subject 6 feet away from its background. So there's some setup that's going to go on there. And then you're going to take one of those lenses and you're going to focus on the same subject, but not flat to the film plane. Keep the subject 6 feet away from its background. So you're just going to take a whole bunch of pictures of the same thing. And then you're going to do that at 2.8 or your widest f-stop, f8, and then 32 or 45, whatever your widest f-stop is going to be. So you've got a total of 9 pictures up here and a total of 3 photos down here. So a total of 12 photos in all that you're going to take for me. And then to present your photos, you're going to process them. I assume if you're shooting in RAW, that then you're going, that you're shooting in RAW, then you're going to save them in a JPEG format. If you want, since it's only an exercise and you want to do this in JPEG format to begin with, you can if you want to. You're going to resize those photos to 1280 on the longest side by 96 pixels DPI. And if you need help with doing that, I can show you how to do that. And then you're going to rename them, put your name in the front. So you can do all of that in your Photoshop or your Bridge or your Adobe Camera Raw. And then by 5 p.m. the day before class, so 5 p.m. on Monday, if you would, upload them to my Dropbox, and I'll send you a link to the Dropbox. There'll be a folder there. And if you are running late, let me know and I can try to accommodate you. But this is a 10 o'clock in the morning class, so I may not be able to get around to it. But if you're running late, just let me know. And then I'll put those photos into a PowerPoint presentation and I'll show them, and then we can talk about them during class. You can talk about your trials and tribulations. We can critique them, and then ask questions about them and that type of stuff, and learn from each other. And half of the fun of this class is the trials and tribulations, the beating your head against the wall, the trying to make it work, the things that didn't work out the way you wanted them to. That's part of the fun of this class. And then I'll critique and I'll ask you questions, and then we'll do lesson 2 after that. So questions on your homework.
No, I'll have to put my thinking cap on. Looks like a lot of fun.
Okay. It'll just teach you how to use that camera, get you in there and using that camera a little bit more. And feel free to do it inside, because it's, you know, we're getting hot outside. And so feel free to do this stuff inside your house if you want to. Okay, questions?
Well, we always have questions after the fact. So
After the fact, exactly. That's what makes it fun. That's the challenge of this, because then we always have questions after the fact. Okay, so you're good for now?
Yeah, so if we get a question, just send an email.
Send
to
me an
you or-
email. I'm
okay.
here. Yeah. So
Okay.
I'm going to stop the